Today, I want to talk to us about reimagining our roles in the fight for tomorrow. 2020 has been an exceptional year, and not in a great way. Early in the pandemic, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy came up with this prophetic quote. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and to reimagine our world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal. It is a gateway between one world and the next. And so as an ethnographer, as a designer, as a facilitator, I have been thinking about what happens when everything breaks down and what can this tell us about the world that we are building anew. And so today I want to talk us through what we have observed around the world in the face of COVID. What are some of the signals happening into the future, and how do we then organize as a collective society in a global world in building the world that we want? So the pandemic has exposed the gross inequalities and the inequities and the injustices in our world. We all know this. At the same time, there have been exciting innovations and efforts and shows of solidarity and of mutual aid and of justice that we've seen around the world. These are just some of the headlines from 2020. But I want to first bring you to my home of Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, part of the epicenter in New York City of the pandemic, to show what the community response has looked like here. This is my home. It is known for glorious block parties in the summer. It is a diverse and racially diverse neighborhood. And this is also the map. We are the big sort of in the middle there, early on in the pandemic. There's my neighborhood is predominantly Black and brown. It has been hit terribly. And so what happened in this period was that communities came together to rally, to help one another. In March of this year, we set up this network called Bed-Stuy Strong. It was started by a writer, Sarah Matthews, here in Bed-Stuy, where we basically said, we need to help one another get through this. We set up an incredibly sophisticated back-end system that I will not take credit for. And neighbors came together to rally, to deliver groceries to neighbors, to set up Wi-Fi in the park so that kids could still go to school, to help people register for elections, register for the census, make sure we were counted. This community response has achieved a lot of wins. We've served about 10% of the neighborhood, serving the most vulnerable, the elderly, the low income, the immunocompromised. But I also know that this is not just in my neighborhood as well. We are seeing these great shows of community solidarity and support around the world. We are seeing these in Chile, the community kitchens that have been set up. I believe this photo here is from Antofagasta. We are seeing these in Chile, in Cameroon. And so as an ethnographer, as a study, as a student of political science and public administration, it has led me to question some of the fundamental assumptions that governments have had around people and around public administration and around how we all come together. We know that many of the, or a lot of the underlying assumptions around modern government are really based on dated notions of human nature from the time of Hobbes here in the Leviathan. It is hereby manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. So Thomas Hobbes believed that men left to our own devices, we will actually descend into this war of man against man. But I think what this year has shown us is that is not true. So what that means is that the mechanisms of government, the justification for big government, for state power to rule the lives of the people, there are fundamental gaps in that logic. Because I believe that what community response has shown us this year is that when we come together, when everything breaks down, at the end of the day, humans are altruistic, humans are generous, humans are creative, and humans help one another. And this reminds me of a quote from the activist and writer Adrienne Marie Brown, which says, "Trust the people and they become trustworthy." And so this grassroots response, I think, is in stark contrast to much of what we have seen, quote unquote, at the top. I'm based in the US, and at the highest levels of government, we have seen denial of the pandemic, blame, corruption, and unwillingness to face the truth, incompetent responses, and sometimes the use of force to crack down on dissenters and protesters. And I know this is not just unique to the US. We are seeing these in other countries around the world as well, and I'm sure this narrative is familiar to all. What happens when this happens at the highest levels of government is it handicaps civil service, it handicaps NGO partners, and what I have seen through my work with international agencies and governments is that the internal politics actually deepen. The existing fragilities are highlighted and they get worse. And there's even a greater mistrust of outsiders and of community members, of amateur change makers, of NGOs, and an unwillingness to open up and to collaborate. And this harms us because mistrust goes both ways, and it's actually a self-reinforcing loop. Once we mistrust the other mistrusts us, and it's very hard to dig out of that hole. Now, some of this could be attributed to just a tension between old power values and quote unquote new power values. So Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Tims's terms. So the difference between bureaucratic top-down state institutions and bottom-up network grassroots efforts. I think that's part of it. And so the different ways that approaches to crisis, to organizing manifest in this time, and I won't go through this table in detail, but is that the fundamental questions that we're asking are different. Government, for all its good intentions, is often asking, what is the right approach? What is the strategic framework under which we should operate? Communities, meanwhile, just say, what needs to be done right now? And how can we do our very best to make that happen? We see this in my community. We see this in the community kitchens that we're seeing springing up all over Chile. And there's a beauty and inspiration to be found in that. And so while the government is thinking about the target change that it wants, what is impact at a great a scale as possible? Communities are thinking about, okay, what is the impact that we can make on one human at a time? And so the sense of urgency, that last row there, we're seeing, governments and states doing good work, but often saying, let's just give it time and see, let's gather all the inputs, let's do our analysis, and communities are acting right here, right now, because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. So some of it is a difference in cultures, that's true. But I think also some of it, as we've seen in the US and around the world, is also manifest from examples of state overreach and of force. And these are questions that we all have to reckon with. And so around the world, we're seeing people this year ask a very simple and basic questions as they have come together to meet their own needs, which is, what is a government? Now, this is from Ori Okullo, Kenyan pundit that many may know, a notable activist, philanthropist, humanitarian based in Kenya. But I think this question I have seen being asked here, and I know has been asked in different ways in Chile, what are the functions of a government and how does that need to evolve? And you see from these tweets in response to Ori's question, not very promising answers. Organized violence and crime, an archaic English noun that means harassment, a species of the leech variety, the strongest, most organized gang in a territory. And someone even asked, do we even need one? Now, as someone that closely works with governments, I don't believe we need to do away with government. I don't think that's right. But I also understand the frustration and the pain and the disillusionment and the mistrust that many people face. And it reminds me of the famous quote by Ronald Reagan. The most terrifying words in the English language are, I am from the government and I am here to help. And so what does this mean for our future? There's mistrust on both sides. Both sides have been wrong, sometimes intentionally, sometimes, just out of circumstance. And so how do we build together? Now, I think this year, the activist and abolitionist and writer Angela Davis has gained a resurgence of popularity. And one of her sayings has come back to haunt me repeatedly. She says, "The problem with reform is that reforms have often rendered the institutions themselves more permanent." Now, I work on a lot of innovation efforts. I work on a lot of reform efforts, and these efforts are generally a way to address the criticisms that institutions face, address the outside criticisms that governments face, to say, how can we do better? But the challenge is these innovation efforts and these reform efforts often don't look at the things that government does well and that government does not do well. And so oftentimes what that does is that brings in critics from the outside and actually doesn't let them get very far in terms of changing the structural mechanics of the public sector. And so we know that we need systems change. And we know that systems change requires all of us. Now, this table here is an attempt at laying out some of the key roles that I see in the fight for the future. And so, we see artists being really good at doing actually what government is not good at, which is imagining bold new futures that honor each person's dignity. As much as we might try, we have bureaucratic and institutional constraints. Activists brings the moral courage. There's think tanks and researchers that can assess different paths. But these roles, I think, are also archetypical, but they're also too idealistic and simple and naive. Because while government's role on the right there is to create policies and deliver services to serve their people, we also know that is too simplistic a framing, and this role needs to evolve to also protect against corrupting interests. And it's not good enough for artists to just imagine and say the world that they want. They also have to advocate for these realities. Activists cannot just protest, they actually have to constructively work on defining paths to dismantling the injustices they see. And so we need systems change, we need all of us, and we need to evolve our roles. But I know it sounds great, it's really, really difficult. Because how do we bring the right actors to the table? How do we overcome mistrust and fear of one another and just the inertia of doing things as they have always been done? How do we agree on a common vision when we all come from such different backgrounds? And how do we move from just all the talking and into the action? So it's difficult, but it's not impossible, because frankly, we all have these different superpowers that we need at the table. Government alone, corporations alone, activists alone are not going to get very far. You can't work on systems change with just imagination or just moral courage or just generosity or just resources. And so we need to all come to the table together. And some might tell me that this is utopian, but I don't think so. The systems and structures that enable and sustain injustice, inequality, and oppressions were intentionally designed. As one of the fiercest and most inspiring critics of neoliberalism in the world, I think Chile is a great example, a great beacon of light in protesting these oppressive systems and structures. And so we also know then that futures that honor and protect justice, equality, and liberation can also be designed. And I know that's an active process going on right now. This isn't a far out dream. My home country of Taiwan has done this previously, but also during COVID. There have only been 7 deaths in Taiwan over the time of the pandemic. And this is because we took a whole of society approach. And so I know Chile is undergoing huge transformations right now. I think the referendum and all the reforms underway are hugely inspiring to many of us in the world. And we are excited to watch and see and learn around what a new whole of society approach can actually look like to making the structural change that we all seek. And the key to whole of society is not that everyone should be in the same room at the same time asking the same questions. No, different actors are suited to answer different questions at different times. So we want the radical imaginations and the moral courage to say, what should our future look like? And we want the generosity of the community groups and the intellectual rigor of the researchers to then map out paths to realizing this. And then finally, companies with their production and distribution ability, governments with their resources and durability can then organize markets and set policies to realize this future. So I'm really excited to see what the future holds for us. I believe this approach is the way to get us there, and thank you for spending the time with me today.